all the Outlook notifications, little dogs are silent? Because I do have a little dog.
We have a 3-month-old baby in the other room, so
here you go.
I'm already apologizing for this.
Okay, so just like the dog, you have to make sure you train the baby not to make any noise during the podcast.
Exactly. I tried to.
Did you put her in the crate as well? Just like my wife did with Frida? Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast. In this show, we talk about our experiences and lessons learned in enterprise architecture and business process management. What's Your Baseline is designed to be for everyone. Newbies who are just getting started with these topics, organizations who want to improve their EA and BPM groups and the value they get from it, as well as practitioners who want to get a different perspective and care about the discipline.
Each episode will tackle different key topics, providing context, background, best practices, and stories from the road, inviting you to learn from our challenges and successes, and demonstrating key tools to help you set up your practice and get the most out of it.
I'm your host, Roland Wolt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlinson. Hey JM, how are you doing today?
Not too bad, Roland. I'm doing pretty good. You know, it's actually, I'm feeling up about things. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in the world that makes you seem sad, but man, I gotta have hope, and that hope is really getting me through these days. How are you doing? How are you feeling?
I'm doing fine, and to be quite honest, I'm super excited today because obviously I like to work in teams, as you know, and the topic of today is actually how to select the right team for your architecture program.
Whoa, that seems hard. I got to be honest. I've been involved in a few different hiring decisions, and man, it really churns my stomach to try and think, is this person the right one? Will they have all these things? Well, is that person the right one? It's like, I feel like I'm going to regret the decision. I always love people too much. So I'm like, I can't choose because I like you both. Well, maybe make it a little bit easier for me. Help me out here, Roland. And
I guess
I know we have a guest, right?
Yes, we do. And I guess in about an hour, you will be smarter. You know, this will be a non-issue. Having said that, let me introduce you to Ansgar Bittermann, our guest for today. And Ansgar, no pressure on you, right? So you got an hour to convince us about your approach.
Welcome to the podcast, Ansgar.
Thank you very much for having me today. Welcome from Berlin.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, this topic has got to be something that everyone's thinking about. You know, this is the time of the Great Resignation, but those people aren't just resigning to leave and never have a job again. They're going to come and get another job somewhere else. And so in a time of great change, we rely on people like you to help us understand what it takes to be worth investing in as a part of a team, and the right fit for the team that you're looking to join. So first and foremost, I want to get a little bit of background on you, because I know a lot of things you're going to say today come from a position of a huge amount of research and a lot of work that's gone into making these models make sense. So first and foremost, tell us about yourself. Who are you? What's your background that sort of brought you to this idea, this expertise that you focused on?
All right. Well, I originally have a master in psychology from the second oldest institute of psychology in the world, from Göttingen. I'm originally from Germany. You might hear that, and Germany and Austria, they're very famous for psychology. Mm-hmm. And over the years after that, I also acquired the license to practice psychotherapy according to the Heilpraktikergesetz here in Germany. But my focus, psychology is a very broad field, and a lot of people, when they hear that you're a psychologist, they think that you're a therapist, and but that's not really true. Normally, you add another education of 5 years to become a full-fledged psychotherapist. So
yeah,
already 5 to 6 years of psychology plus 5 years of therapy. So my focus in the field of psychology was mostly assessing people, and my personal interest is in nonverbal communication, because these are nonverbal cues you see, and then you can infer some sort of intention. But just quick reminder what psychology basically is. It developed out of a philosophy. We're trying to answer the great questions of life.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a free will? What can you hope for? What should you do? The Kantian questions. We try to answer that. So a lot of psychologists, we are idealists, but we try to give ourselves some frame in which we work. And this is very, very close to enterprise architecture, because we try to solve these big questions with data and science. So So that's what we do, and a lot of statistics get into our questions.
Yeah, and as you know, Ansgar, here on our podcast, we do have a soft spot in our heart for Germans with a psychology degree. Because
I know, I heard you have a minor.
Yeah, I do
psychology.
have a minor in psychology, so it happens.
It
and I have nothing.
Preaching to the choir here.
Yeah,
I think I sat through one psychology class where the professor got up at the front and he went, "What is time?" And I was like, "It's time for me to get the heck out of here." That's what it is.
Well, to be very honest, I had my epiphany. I was, I think, 16 or 17, and once a month I went to this philosophy seminar, and it was a time of Sophie's Choice, and I really liked philosophy. And then one time they invited a cognitive psychologist, and he literally bashed all the philosophers in the room and said, "Okay, we did this and this experiment here. You see it on the graphs. Here's the data. Free will is a myth." And it really touched me, and I thought, like, okay, I want to study that. And so basically psychology, it's half of it is data science, and I think 11 semesters or 5.5 years of statistics we study, and then the rest, we're doing content. And one of the things there is also test theory, test construction, which we are going back later. And so my master thesis was actually, I wrote an algorithm to put a camera on two people who are talking, and then I tried to infer their intentions based on their body language. And, so not just facial expressions, because you can control a lot of facial expressions, but you can't really control your leg movement or the way you move your hips. So, and then I got my taste for experimenting on that.
It's funny when you're describing some of the things you're doing. I don't know if you've seen Blade Runner, but this feels a lot like the Voight-Kampff test, where you're analyzing the you see a turtle and it's flipped on its back. What do you do? And it's like, well, you're a replicant. It's
Well, yeah. I mean, in the end, it's super interesting, and but it's not something. I mean, it's something what people did all their life. People judge everybody since the beginning of time. And I mean, the first thing man was being done to is being judged by God. So but the thing is that people mostly judge others on a very, very low level, and they're mostly wrong. And so what we do in psychology is we try to, and now comes the scientific terms, we try to have what we observed, we call it the observed variable or the observed value, and we compare it to the real value. So basically, I look at you and, or I give you a test, and let's say test about your personality. So, and then, in psychology, what we do is, this concludes my discussion about what is psychology. We try to observe something or a variable and infer it to a real variable. And over time, we try to optimize that so that the delta between these two values is actually minimalized. And this is basically what machine learning is also doing.
Yeah, which brings me to another very interesting topic, because I know that you also use your knowledge and your affinity to algorithms and AI and machine learning. And not only are you making a living out of it, which I'm pretty sure we'll talk about in half a second, but you're also running a podcast, which JM and I had the honor to be a guest on a couple of months ago, which is the AI Pocketbook. So can you talk a little bit about that? How is that going for you?
Well, I started it when I did a course in the MIT, and I met a lot of very interesting people, and I thought, like, how can I keep in touch with them? And so I thought, like, wow, they're coming from all over the world. Let's do a weekly Zoom call, and out of this weekly Zoom call, this podcast developed, because we thought, we're not recording what we are talking about. And so we focus on topics about AI, how to implement AI. It's not like that we are talking about specific algorithms, because that is something, a lot of people are not really interested in. We are focusing about topics how can we implement AI? What is the right team to use AI? What are the right project management methods to implement AI in your company?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what the podcast is all about. It's a lot of fun, and I learn every day new things, and it gives me the chance to have guests like you to come on the show and get to know you. Otherwise, it would be called stalking, but then it's just.
But we're happy to support you in your efforts, and we're happy to have you on our podcast today. But before we go into the actual meat of the conversation that we have, when we're going to talk about how to select a team and all these things, let's talk a little bit more about you as a person. So, what are your hobbies, your interests? Do you have any bucket list items that you want to do before you go to the farm up north, or what are your plans on your personal side?
I'm not planning to go to the farms that early now. So I'm originally I was born in Germany, but I moved to the US when I was 15, 16. So I lived in Hawaii, which for me is an amazing melting pot. It's a melting pot between East and West. And it gave me a nice introduction to the American school system and an introduction to an American standardized testing system. And and after that, I went back to Europe, but then I moved a lot through Europe. So I lived in Switzerland, Austria, Bulgaria, Poland, UK, and then now we're in Berlin. So I'm living here with my family, and my personal interest is next to AI. I like history, because I think people need roots and they need to know where they're coming from. So this is and in my spare time I write novels, and that's my that's the how do you call it in Germany, the Ausgleich. How do you call it?
To have a balance. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my balance. To write history novels. So but that's what I do. On my bucket list, I really want to go to Machu Picchu, and because I'm fascinated with walls. If you see ancient walls, that's amazing how they build it. And I always wanted to go to Machu Picchu, to the original walls which were built on top of, which were under the temples there. So I'm fascinated with ancient antediluvian walls.
So maybe we see each other at some point in time, because one of my bucket list items is to drive down the Pan American Highway, and obviously that goes through Peru as well.
Well, then let's do that.
Yeah, it'd be a very fun rolling an Ansgar at Machu Picchu. I gotta tell you, I have been there, and it is incredible. Well, that's wonderful, Ansgar. I'm really glad to hear a lot of your story and your background. I think that also gives a lot of weight to what you're going to say today, because I think that the messages you bring forward are about using science to help explain humanity.
Yes,
and that's a difficult conversation to have. So to know that what you're coming at it from the perspective of is from a lot of research, and particularly from a very diverse set of research backgrounds. It's not just a single threaded. It's not just an ivory tower from where you sort of sat and judged all beneath you, but rather quite the opposite. It seems like you sort of integrated yourself with a bunch of different cultures, a bunch of different research backgrounds, a bunch of different situations and organizations, and that's going to lead us to our very first, and I think the big question that we're going to start the conversation off today with, which is selecting a team. Because as we talked about, there's a lot of movement happening, particularly right now in the architecture space. And a lot of managers are really struggling to get the right people, keep the right people, build functional and top performing teams. We had a podcast before where one of our guests said, we don't want to hire, B players. We only want to hire superstars. We only want to hire the best people who are going to work together the best to make something. So tell me about your approach. What do you try to do with, testing and in general using psychology as a feeder for excellent human resources?
Yeah, I mean, there's in psychology, this question has been, discussed for over 100 years. And so the theories I'm using, they're pretty well developed. They roughen the edges a lot. So what I'm doing when we look at teams, the one question is, what should these teams be? What is the basic function a person needs to be the superstar in these teams? And what we see is that a mixture of personality and cognitive abilities. If we can assess a person before they join the team in these two areas, combined a little bit with motivation, what's the what drives a person? So if we look at these three areas and assess them in these areas, then we have a very, very good idea of who will perform well and who won't. That helps us a lot, because these tests, when we do them, cognitive abilities, we test them in 2.5 hours, personality in 30 minutes. So basically, it's 3 hours plus a few more tests when it comes to attention. So let's say 3.5 hours of testing. And then we have a very, very good predictor if somebody will be a good team player or not.
Yeah, I do have a question just to bring it back. So
Sure.
We're not only talking about selecting new people.
No.
We're also talking about, as we all know, small companies don't have the luxury of hiring everybody under the sun. It's also finding the right person in your current organization that you have that fits the team. Is that correct?
Exactly. Just imagine you're a CEO, you join a new company with, 30, 40 people, and you have your magical 100 days. The reality is you don't have your 100 days. I mean, you join on Monday, and on Thursday you have to make the first decisions. So you have a very, very limited amount of time where you have to make very, very crucial decisions. And so we can screen existing teams, existing companies, and make a landscape or make a map for the supervisors or the CEOs or head of departments to see where can we place a person so that it fills that role the best. You talked about the Great Resign. Why is that? Before the Great Resign, we had studies where it says that up to 80% of the people don't feel well in the role they are having right now. 80%. That's 4 out of 5 people are not fit to the role they're in. When we are testing for personality or cognitive abilities, it's not about being good or being bad. It's about, does that person fit in that specific role? And to add a little bit more complexity, when you have a small team, or if you have a bigger team, then you have to see that certain team members are actually complementing each other in their different personalities. And that is something very interesting where a lot of people are not looking for.
So when I think about what you just said, the 80% who are disengaged and don't fit into the role, I would assume that the minority of the organizations do have proper role profiles. So when I think about our audience, think about architects, or think about in your field, AI, how would such a profile look like? What do you actually look for when defining those roles? Because it's obviously not just the tasks that somebody has to do, because otherwise everybody would want to work for Starbucks, where everything is very, very organized and by the playbook.
Exactly. So, I started off with AI, and now we extended actually our services to other companies because we realized everybody's needing that. So, and first we just offered the tests, and then I always ask for the job description, and many job descriptions came back, half empty, and I realized they never really sat down and analyzed the role they want to fill. So what I do, I actually go to the companies and I sit down with them, and we make it like an input-output model, So, and I sit down with them. It's a CPOC model. It's so okay. The person gets a stimulus. Just imagine a employee sitting on their desk. When are they moving? What kind of stimulus is coming in? So, and then what does the stimulus is actually doing with that person? What kind of output should that person do? And how do I control that output? So, and you're very, very close to Lean or Six Sigma operational approach to HR. So, and then once we have the CPOC model, we deduct basically a job description out of it. And so if somebody says, okay, he has to respond a lot, or she has to respond a lot to emails or calls, or has to be, multitasking, then based on that, we are looking for somebody who is able to do multitasking. Or, in our personality profile, they're, for example, able to be emotionally stable, because we know that multitasking is very stressful for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So I sit down with them. We do tasks, we do personal requirements, we do personality requirements. We look at the team which is already existing. So then we deduct the personality profile from the existing team so that they fit. And then we have a very nice job description. And out of that job description, we deduct another, it's called structured interview with the mostly HR manager or secretary, or is having with the candidates. Because what I see is most of the qualified people are not lost in the interview with the CEO, they're lost in the interview with the secretary.
Oh, interesting.
Or the intern. If you have a company, we're focusing on small and medium companies. So medium in Germany means up to 1,000 people. But we see that in small companies, they don't have HR at all, right? So what do? They have the intern pre-selecting profiles wherever they find them. And then they get 50 out of them. First, some of the questions, what kind of keywords are they looking for? So the intern is then able to select the keywords for themselves. So, when you really look, it's very sad, these kind of processes. So we go in there and, we teach people what kind of keywords to look for. We define with them what kind of, text messages they should write, and whom not to throw out. Because what we see is that somebody is, for example, shy, but on the other hand has a high cognitive abilities, they're not doing well in these initial interviews with the initial interviewers. So that's why it's so important to do this proper testing, so that you keep the high profile people, which are maybe not good salespeople, selling themselves in the beginning, and to give everyone a chance,
Yeah, that's interesting. We had a conversation with Jason a couple episodes ago about that exact kind of topic. We asked the question, how does somebody who maybe isn't a great communicator in verbal communication sell themselves for a position that they might be excellent for, but explaining it is hard, or they're not naturally an extrovert. If you think about it in that sort of MBTI context. And he was like, the best way to do it is be brilliant at the basics, which I think was a really good answer from a recruiting perspective. But from the opposite, from a selection perspective, that seems like you're trying to account for that bias in the mechanisms of selection on the recruitment side, on the side of the employer or the prospective employer. I wanted to loop back on the cost of this conceptually. Like, what happens when you don't look at this? I know we've talked about the Great Resignation and the disconnection, and Roland and I exchange a lot of text messages about this idea of disconnected, experienced employees. What other costs do you see companies paying by not having this approach to recruiting and to team evaluation and construction?
Well, if you think about it, a normal interview, and when I mean normal is, or interview process, you write something yourself, and you don't have the assessment tools we are using. We're looking at 5 to 25% success rate.
Oh, yeah. That's not good at all.
No, it's between 7. So, if you flip it around, it's 75 to 95%. It's not good.
Wasted time, yeah.
It's wasted time. But that means, this number is reflected in 80% feeling not well. So, the one thing you have a lot of people leaving the company, or they're quitting internally, as we call it. They're not highly motivated. They are passive. Maybe they're passive aggressive. And they're at the end of the day, the whole company is suffering.
So me being the professional deform idiot, is that a word, JM? Person, I'm just thinking process in the back of my mind, right? So if I understand you correctly, I think we've established that homegrown approaches to team selection and hiring are with a very high probability hit or miss.
Yes.
But then I hear the first step is, well, look at the original team that's already there and the people who are in there. Second, create the profiles for those jobs that you have to staff. And then the third one is then go into testing, or what is the next step in that process?
Well, the next step, what I always like is to do skill testing first. So at the end of the day, who cares if somebody's brilliant if he can't do the task? So and that mostly weaves out a lot of people, because they apply for 100 jobs, and then if you tell them, okay, now it's skill testing time, and then depending on the role, what the skill testing is, maybe you do presentation, maybe you do coding, maybe you do math. And then it's a good thing to develop these kind of skill tests with the teams I'm working with, because they really have to sit down and say, okay, what should that person actually be doing? What is a transformational team? What are they doing the whole day long? And then the skills, depending on the role, you do skill testing. Either we do it via Zoom, or people come inside of the company and they're doing it for half a day or day. Or we send them something and they just give the skill test back. Once they've been doing that, then we go into before that, we had this structured interview, for these key things. For example, I need somebody who has 5 years of experience, and then that person only had 2, so we just weave them out. And then after the skill testing, we go into the assessment and to the psychological assessment. And after that, the skill plus the psychological assessment is presented to the CEO, head of, or whoever is responsible for that. And then we discuss all the green flags and the red flags.
Yeah, I find that very interesting, because I think there's 2 aspects that you haven't mentioned. And one is motivation, right? Yeah. So how does, to say JM's words, how does the candidate sell him or herself? And I remember Jason in the previous podcast saying, well, your first interview, it's all about motivation, right? You want to show that you want this job. The second thing is more like a personal pet of mine. I like the method of assessment center, right? That might be because of my history. It was invented in the Reichswehr in the 1920s, blah, blah. And I did a class in university as part of my psychology minor where we did assessment center, and I was one of those observers and all these things. And I like to see how people actually behave, which is different than doing tests. Is that also something that you include in your tests? And if so, how?
Okay, so we have to differentiate the word assessment. Every psychological test is an assessment. In the business world, assessment centers were very popular at a certain point in time, which some companies are still doing them. But assessment center means you invite somebody and they are there for 2 or 3 days, and they do tasks, and then they're being observed. What we see I've done fair share of my own assessment centers. It's always fun, and that is unfortunately the big but here, they're not reliable.
Oh, interesting.
So, really?
Yes. And the problem is, if you're an observer, the so-called inter-rater reliability is very low. Is very low. And if you would do the same people, observe the same people a week later, the intra-rater reliability, meaning that you would give the same scores next week, is also low.
Oh, interesting.
So, and so that means what we talked about, the observed and real variable. So the reliability of assessment centers is low. So the highest reliability is cognitive testing plus personality testing. So we are scoring here between 73 and 80%. While assessment centers, on the other hand, roughly between 40 and 50%.
Now you bursted my bubble, and I just go back in the corner and start crying.
No. But this is, there are some misconceptions which never die. For example, brainstorming. Brainstorming is something which does not work. I've never, and there are so many studies in psychology which proves that if you have a group of people and they sit in a room and they're brainstorming, it's really bad.
It's groupthink. Groupthink within given borders, like what is expected from me to say. That could be what are the products that we offer to clients, or what is do I need a little bit of spit licking to my boss, and all these type of things. Yeah,
exactly. And then you have always a bully there, or, Steve doesn't like Karen, and then Karen doesn't say anything, and, stuff like that. So that's why, these are some sort of these misconceptions. The good thing is that if you're doing these testings, what we are doing or using these tests, it's much more economically valuable, because it only takes a few hours and it's more reliable. So it's cheaper and better. So that's why I chose doing that.
I think about paid internships as probably maybe I would say the best in my experience for getting an assessment of a candidate, but that's very time consuming and costly. Yeah. Like you're gonna spend 3 to 6 months giving somebody a chance to prove themselves, whereas in 3 to 6 hours you could get a relatively equivalent assessment of their future potential as an employee of the company. That's wildly different. And you talk about decision making, that's a shortcut that is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, and the thing is, I work with a lot of, let's say, introverted people. And personally, I like them. I would consider even myself as an introvert. Introvert does not mean that they're shy. It just means that they also like to be by themselves. But if somebody likes to be by themselves, that means that, they like to think. So don't you want to have somebody who likes to think? Yeah, of course. So that's why, these initial interviews, I don't really care for them, and I don't, it doesn't really matter for me. For me, I like to look at what kind of personality profile they have, and then we build upon on that. Then you interview them differently.
Sounds good. So let's talk specifically about the areas you're looking to select from. So I know you've got models that you use. I think we talked before about there's a few different areas you look at specifically. Let's break these down. Let's start to talk about sort of how this test assesses somebody and what components are important at a high level, and then we'll dig into them individually.
Yeah. So just because that got a lot of heat in the media over the last, let's say, that's 30, 40 years, because a lot of people misuse these tests. And, when I went to America, it was ridiculous. I mean, they gave me a school placement test. I mean, as a German, I had a few years of English. And so they tested my English, but they also tested my math abilities. But they didn't account for me not being English speaker. And then, when I did the math test, Roland knows that. In Germany, we write the 1 differently than in America, so for them, it all looked like a 7. And when you divide, division, we just write division differently. So I had no idea what was the dividend and what was the divisor. But at the end of the day, they placed me, they gave me a 17% in math abilities, and they put me in a class where I was like, I didn't really belong there. So, but it took me the whole year to go from class to prove that I'm actually, more knowledgeable in math. And then I ended up in analysis. And then they gave me a medal for math achievements because I rushed through the classes. But this is an example. If you use the right test on the wrong person, it's not an accurate result. So what we are trying to do, we try to assess somebody as unbiased as possible. So if somebody's mother tongue is, Syrian or Arabic, then we give them a test in Arabic, although they might have been living here for 15 years. So that's what we're doing.
Maybe we're at a point where it's time after half an hour to have a little break. So, but before we give some time back to our listeners to think about some things, some questions that I'm going to ask, let's just recap where we are. So we said, think about process, look at the team, come up with the profiles, do an initial screening, and then invite people for the tests. And after the break, we're going to talk about how does that look in more detail. But before we go there, I would love you, our dear listeners, to think about the structures of your team and how you have assembled teams in the past. Which different personalities and skills and attitudes do you find in your teams? And how do you today find the right people to staff your teams? We're going to leave you alone for a couple of seconds, and we'll be back after the break.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for giving that a little listen. I mean, I really love that we have music interspersed with conversation and thought leadership. It really adds a little spice. And thanks again to our friend Jeremy Voltz for these wonderful pieces of music. Now, I wanted to loop back on the subject of bias because I do want to get into the testing conversation itself, what the contents of tests are. But just to throw that on the table, I know it's a sensitive topic. I mean, I got a story myself. I was once tested for math aptitude going into high school. And I came from an alternative school where we didn't really do much testing. And so I remember getting drummed out of every school I tested into except for one. And then the very first year of that school, winning all the math awards and going to Math Olympics. I had simply never taken a standardized test before. And so I know that, accounting for bias has been a lot of what you do. I know there are also a few different bias styles. So when we take a look at like learning style, experience taking tests, cultural backgrounds, contextual knowledge, and even just gaming, people gaming the test to try and get a different personality result and things like that. How do you accommodate for that? How do you address that with the way in which you approach testing? And let's close the issue that you've seen mechanisms that really do reduce or eliminate a lot of the structural bias that has been a scar on standardized testing.
Yeah. I mean, what we see nowadays, a lot of companies, they're using their own tests or the tests they developed. I would highly recommend not to do that because the tests we are using, we're working with a publishing house, and it's a scientific publishing house. We have access to over 600 tests in 17 languages. But we know that every test we're using has been, has been highly scientifically, tested itself. And there's a whole field in science called test construction, which just deals with the fact, is that a good test or not? We have a lot of reliabilities and other variables we can look at if a test is good or not.
I remember those painfully because that was you must pass this test and never do tests about tests by people who make tests. Exactly. So that really stinks.
That's a Russian nesting doll of tests if I ever heard one.
Yep. Yeah. The R value and all those wonderful things. I remember that very vividly.
Yes.
So you would give the same test in multiple different contexts to multiple different groups of people and try to make sure that the distributions align to show that this test is unbiased. Is that what you do?
Well, if you behind every test there's a mathematical model, and psychologists, they love regression. So basically, what we have is we have the observed variable, and then we have the real variable, and then we have these regression factors which we try to count in. For the result. And what we do, I mean, these tests we're using, for example, the standardized personality test we are using has been repeated and mirrored in I don't know how many cultures in different settings with age groups and any kind of variable you can think of. They try to vary that to get what we call stable factors, or in mathematical terms, where the factors, they're not interacting with each other, so that they're basically a 90-degree angle independent of each other. So, and then, the test we are using has been developed and improved for 60 or 70 years. So, and a myriad of scientific studies have been done on that. When it comes to the cognitive ability testing, I mean, this has been going on for over 100 years. But there are some which, focus on one area where, for example, say, does cognitive ability, does it have a fluid factor or a crystallized factor? What we obviously want to have in cognitive abilities, we want to split between what is your upbringing. For example, if you went to a amazing school and, both your parents were a professor for history and they just bombard you with knowledge, we want to, separate these two things and say, okay, what did God give you as a hardware and what did you do out of it? Because if we can't separate that, then social factors always play a much bigger role in the result I'm seeing in you. And as a company, I want to know, is this person trainable or not? And, by separating these two factors, I can see, and I've seen it in the past a lot of times, somebody who has not been given a lot of chances in life, but they have a very good ability to learn, and if you teach them properly.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned cognitive ability as one of the areas. So if we could drill down a little bit more, what would be those areas that you want to look for when selecting your architecture team?
In the cognitive abilities, we are looking for, obviously, numerical abilities, the ability to deal with numbers and with data. Because transformation is a lot about concepts. And what we see is that somebody who is very good in numerical abilities has also the ability for concepts. We're also looking, and that is something for verbal abilities or verbal cognitive abilities, because it's all about language. The third thing, and we found that is something when it comes to figural knowledge or the ability to think in 3D, and a lot of people who are charging high on that, they have the ability to visualize, 3D models of a certain process, which is very, very nice.
Yeah, some abstraction.
Exactly. So this is the cognitive ability we are looking also, and this is very important nowadays for attention span, because the younger people who are a lot on social media, they have a very low. They score a lot on that. So we want to have a good thing on that. And the other areas is personality, where we go for emotional stability. Transformational teams need to be emotionally stable. They need to be able to be conscientious. Conscientiousness is actually next to cognitive abilities, one of the most important factors we are looking for. Because if you're not orderly, if you're not industrious, if you don't feel sold to a task, then an unconscientious person is not something which you want to have as an employee.
Yeah, we say something at one of the companies I work with /run about the three principles of a person that we want to work with, that are diligence, humility, and generosity.
Exactly.
I think those are really important characteristics, that you're good at what you do, that you're interested and willing to learn, and that you're here to support a team. Exactly. Without all three of those things, you've got people dropping off in different aspects that will make that team start to fall apart. No one wants to work with people who aren't good at their job. No one wants to work with people who don't want to listen and learn. And everybody hates those selfish people who just take everything for themselves. And, we can whisper network about people who I call negative influencers all you want. But, or it starts to put a real crack in the foundations of an organization when you don't do this right. And I think when you talk about emotional stability, that's another thing that's really interesting. How do you test for emotional stability? That feels like you have to put them under pressure conditions, or you have to describe scenario. How do you test for emotional stability?
So, well, we test for these 5 areas, and next to the emotional stability, we also test for sociability, which you just talked about. And one aspect of sociability is being humble, and And the other one is being open for new things. So if somebody's not open to new things, then they're not really good for a transformational team. We test, what we do have is a 206 question test, and it's a self-describing test, and that's where test construction comes in, and where actually the power of that test comes in, that we are not having a live in vitro pressurize somebody. This personality test actually just is asked the people to describe situations from their past. And it's funny, over the 206 questions, that the results are very, very stable and very good towards the reality. If you're an existing team, we give also to your colleagues these questionnaires describing you. And if you have this 360-degree thing, we put these things together and we get a pretty good picture of you.
Well, I'm happy to hear that you don't do the, how was it called? Kobayashi Maru test that is happening in Star Trek,
Oh, listen, the Kobayashi Maru it has its function. Never forget that. You got to put people in situations that you see how they can best adapt to an unwinnable situation. Yeah. I dig that. I dig it, though.
So let's put it together. So we heard cognitive abilities, attention span, emotional stability, skills was one thing that you test for. Anything else that you would look for when doing an assessment?
Yeah, the ability for being logical. And
okay.
Yeah, that's overrated.
Only to roll in, but logic does matter, particularly in architecture and AI. That's a big piece of the puzzle.
Yes,
and interesting. And how do you test for the ability to be logical? Is it those sort of like A is to B as C is to D, or like?
Yeah, exactly. So there are different types of questions they have, or for example, you have like 1, 3, 5, 7. What's the next number? So we try to deduct logic from all three areas. So from the verbal, the numerical, and the 3D visualization area. So we deduct logic out of that. So logic by itself is not an independent factor, but it's been deducted out of these three areas.
Interesting. And actually, I had a question for you, because I know I've gone through a couple of different these tests as part of the job that I have. It's fun for myself. I'm an ENFP to everyone out there who loves the MBTI scale for personalities. And one of the things we did, I think, was really interesting, was did a fit test person to person. So how much do you gauge these tests and sort of work them into what an overall team would look like? Or is it an individual candidate one at a time, and then sort of scoring that person for the kind of role? So it's person to role or versus person to person?
We do all together. So we have, normally a company, they have a really big problem to see how should that role be. So what we are actually taking, there's some general rules out there, but I would not suggest using them because they're very general profiled. So what we are doing is we're going into a company and say, okay, give me 3 people who really fit into that role. And in your company, just not in another company, but in your company, or just even one person, it's like, this is the ideal bookkeeper, this is the ideal manager, and then we take that as the ideal profile, and then we test against that. So basically, we invite that person, we test that person too, and then we see how these two are differing. And then after that, having all this information, then having the interview with the candidate, it's much more interesting.
Right. So you're fitting to role, which includes all the other factors, the people, the responsibilities, the organization and its culture as a whole, the industry that you're in. Oh, that's interesting. So it's neither person to role flat or person to person. It is person to ecosystem.
Exactly.
That's super cool. I love it. So I wanted to go through the, sort of the questions we ask when we talk about solutions all the time, which is sort of the who, what, when questions. So if you're thinking about getting testing, if you're talking to an organization out there, when are the times in which you look to get testing? When does it make sense to reach out to someone like you and your organization to have this conversation?
Most of the time people are coming because they don't find the right person, they have tried to do it on their own and they just hired the wrong people. Just if you think about your company of, I don't know, 10 people or even 50 people, and you have just one person who is toxic, they can bring everybody down. So there's never a wrong time to start this, because there's always somebody leaving, always somebody coming, and assessing the existing team on their roles. Mostly when the people are coming, there's something wrong in their company. Maybe the dynamics is wrong. Maybe they are getting hot, blood pressure when they're having certain weekly meetings, or something is not working. And but since the company is a living organism, we always, it's always good to start. And I've never gone to a company where I saw, oh, they didn't need it.
So what type of organizations and I'm thinking out loud here, what type of organizations do reach out to you? Because the interviews that I went through, and I'm just thinking about the conversation that we had Jason when we were talking about recruiting and the typical process that candidates go through, that typically does not include testing. So what type of organizations? Yeah, well, convince me or convince all the organizations that listen to the podcast. What is different with the organizations that do a test-based approach, and how do you see them succeed over organizations that would follow a traditional interview or role play or whatever approach?
Well, mostly 80% of all companies in a society are small to medium companies. So if you're looking at very big companies, for example, doing assessment center is a cultural thing, right? And they don't want to change. Or there's a company which makes so much money or they can burn a lot of risk capital, where it doesn't really hurt to fail. But mostly companies come to me who want to improve themselves, who are too small to fail, who have people in critical situations, and who just want to be better because they're living or they're working in a competitive landscape. And the companies who are coming to me, they really want to have a solution. There's no ideology. They just want to have a good team. They want to have everybody having a good time. They want to sell their product, and they want to be good.
So then the question is, what kind of outputs do you give them? I mean, obviously, the output that they want at the end of the day is a functional organization, a high-performing, high-functioning organization. But what to get them there do you provide specifically?
Yeah, so I describe the new roles. We test the new candidates. So we're very, very deeply ingrained in their recruitment process. The output they get from us is, mostly no one is leaving the company, so they don't have these, outliers, or they're getting, satisfied. The people are doing their job. They're not resigning, and they're just working, and they're just, the whole company is just functioning.
I think, but specifically, like, do you have reports that you provide? You said job description. When I was saying outputs, I'm thinking like specifically like hard documentation or like assessments and guides and like scoring systems. I know. When we talked before, you showed a little bit of a scoring system that you use.
Sure. That's what we give. So basically, first of all, they get their job description, then they get their structured interview, then they get afterwards a whole report of all the testing, and they get an assessment from me or another senior assessment manager when it comes to how to read the graph properly, because they are not psychologists, we are. So, and then we sit down with them, go through the report, and show them, okay, these are the green flags, these are the red flags. And then they get also an 101 with a candidate, where we actually assess the candidate.
Well, Ansgar, that sounds really, really interesting. The question that I have in the back of my mind is obviously, well, how do you do this? Right? We're living in these special times, even though the majority of the world, or at least the Western world or the American world, has decided that COVID is over. And everybody meets in person. Well, we'll see how that goes. But I think one takeaway that we got from the pandemic is a lot of things happen now digitally. So how do you approach the evaluation of candidates situation in that remote scenario?
Yeah, so we developed a digital assessment center, so we can test anyone everywhere in the world. We are fully ingrained into remote first, and because a lot of people or candidates we are interviewing, they want to work remote with the companies. So for us, being 100% digital was our goal, and I think this is really working with a lot of companies, and this differentiates us also from traditional testing companies.
Yeah, which I also think is obviously, I think from my perspective, the biggest shift. People don't want to go back into the office where they were treated badly and whatever, spend hours in the commute and in all these things. So organizations will have to change, which is obviously then also something that you will have to test for.
Exactly. Yeah, and being able to do it digitally seems really advantageous. I mean, you talked about the human factor, but if you can put the data behind the human factor through a digital assessment, that changes the game entirely. And I wanted to close out this section because I think we've gone through some really interesting points on the assessments, and I wanted to turn it back to our audience to think about the teams in their organizations. So think about what you're doing, what's working well, and what challenges are you seeing that come up as a result of personality, aptitude, skills in the way you deliver. If you could work with someone like Ansgar and bring these sorts of testing into place, when would you engage, and ultimately, what change would you like to see in outcomes of your organization from introducing testing along the way? We're going to leave you to think about that question with some music. We'll come back in a couple moments with our thoughts, our conclusions, and a farewell to this episode.
Welcome back. Before we go into the closing out of this episode, Ansgar, I do have one more question for you, because we were talking about the individual who gets tested. Mm-hmm. We have not spoken about the manager, the supervisor, the person who is tasked to lead those people, because I can imagine now they have the visibility into the different profiles of the people in those categories that we just described, and they should take advantage of those, shouldn't they?
Yeah, actually, they should, because leadership development, being a leader, being somebody who's managing people, it's a big word, but a lot of people don't really know what to do or how to do that. And let's be honest. As a psychologist, we have to be honest. And
yeah.
And leading people is not always the same. If you have a team of, let's say, software developers, you would lead them differently than a team of salesmen or saleswomen. And so what we are doing is, when we look at these profiles, we teach people specifically, people are supervising or they're managing people, we teach them specifically how to lead different, let's say, people with different personalities or people with different cognitive abilities. Because if somebody, for example, somebody who's, let's call them smart, they might seem lazy to a manager, because they finished their task early and then they just don't do anything. So leading creative people, leading smart people, leading introverted people, leading people who are interested in a lot of things is completely different than other profiles. So it gives us the ability to teach leaders in seminars, in 1.5 hour seminars, to very, very specific topics, and make them better managers.
Yeah, I remember that a lot of leaders are just people who were good at their job before, who have now been promoted to a very different job. One of my favorite examples, my brother's a fantastic, half brother's a fantastic coder. He's really good at coding, and he was promoted to be the leader of all of the developers. But he's a really good coder. And now he suddenly had to learn all these brand new skills because the only thing he wasn't doing was coding. So as a leader, you need to be enabled to know how to teach and work with people like you, different than you. And those are skills that don't just automatically come about because you're the best at your job.
Yeah.
They come out through a concerted training, education, socialization, and awareness program that it sounds like, Ansgar, you've really got as a part of your core offering for organizations.
Yeah, JM, but I have seen organizations struggle, and literally in the last 2 organizations that I worked, where they have a career path being defined, just like you described with your brother, you get promoted up to a point where you might not be able to fulfill this, the Peter principle. And I've seen organizations struggling with building out career paths for people who are not interested in the managerial role. Right, to have somebody, and organizations like Microsoft do that with the Microsoft Fellow program, for example, where they're really good at their thing and they have an opportunity to grow into career ranks and salaries and all that stuff by being good at what they're good for. Right, and that is actually a big challenge.
That's something we need to break in this industry. Stop giving people leadership roles just because they're good at their job. Have them deliver more of what they do rather than asking to learn a brand new skill. Have people who are good leaders lead rather than good technical people pull them off the workforce to give them a job where they don't do their job that they're good at. That seems crazy, right?
I mean, in psychology, we have two theories which are actually working pretty well. When you see people can develop either hierarchically or in their knowledge. Mm-hmm. And we see in these personality profiles already, and that's why we also do testing when somebody wants to be, or when somebody wants to promote somebody else. We test them first, and we see in the personality profile if they would be a good leader or not, because there are trigger personality items which will indicate if somebody is going to massively fail, or is going is up for the challenge.
Which is, as you said before, organizations are living creatures, right? So move on and learn, right? But having said that, very interesting conversation with you, Ansgar. So first of all, thanks for being the guest on our show today. The one thing that I'm thinking about for the last, 20 minutes now, what's next for Ansgar? You reached the pinnacle of your career by being guest in our podcast here. So what is the next thing for
you? Well, the next thing, I just finished my book about AI. So about Pocket Guide AI. And it's a painful process, in the publishing world, to get it to life. And the pace of the publishing world is a little different than what I was expecting. So let's see when this is going to be published. So that's the next thing. And but basically, when it comes to the company, we're working here on streamlining the experience for the user to make it more scalable, make us more accessible in the digital space. We add a lot of new languages, which allows us also to have this, remote testing much more. And also, as I said, about leadership, using that for leadership development. Mm-hmm. And so that's what's the next thing coming up. So I hope in the next months that there's some development.
Well, I can imagine then that you want to double dip on your career. So we'll have you as a guest in a future episode. I can really see it once you have your AI book being finished.
Thank you. Well, it is finished. It just needs to be published. And but thank you very much, guys, for having me. It was very lovely. You're great hosts, and you're doing a good show.
Thank you. But now, obviously, the ultimate question. I'm pretty sure we convince a ton of people that they need your services. How can people reach out to you?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing is if you can just pass my email to them, or they can go to our website, pocketguide.ai, or to our other website called personio-partner.com, because we're also digitalizing HR processes and departments. and we partnered up with Personio.
Well, that sounds really fun. I'll certainly be going there after this interview, and hopefully all of you will too. And that's me turning the spotlight back to you, friends. Thank you so much for listening to this show and for liking, subscribing, most importantly, sharing. So if you've liked what you've heard today, or if you've watched or listened to anything else we've created, please make sure to share our podcast and our shorts with all of your friends across the industry, across industries, and get more people loving and talking, liking, subscribing to the What's Your Baseline podcast. Now, of course, all this information for the show are going to be available on our website at what'syourbaseline.com. Or if you're thinking specifically about this episode, the full transcript with all the links, including the emails and things like that, are going to be available at what'syourbaseline.com/episode 22. Well, thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to Ansgar. Thank you to Roland. And until next time, friends, I've been J.M. Erlinson.
I am Ansgar Bittermann.
And I'm Roland Volt.
And we will see you in the next one.